I think this is the greatest book I've ever read. Uh, and I think honestly most people should read it too. So this is my book review as well as recommendation to read The Road Less Traveled by M. Scott Peck. I'll say that this is by far, I think, the most interesting book I've ever read, as well as I think it'll be like the most interesting book you would ever read. I will say most people aren't as, if you're into psychology and how people think or just life in general, if you know anybody who has any kind of, I don't know, sad, if you're depressed or happy or you want to know how to be happy, and this sounds like some kind of self-help book. In a weird way, this kind of is like the most in-depth self-help book you'll ever read. For some reason, it just doesn't feel like that when you read it. It just talks about why people do the things they do and how they feel the way they feel. And I guess this guy's qualification is, I think he's a doctor in psychology. So the reason I find it so interesting is he backs up all his statements with real life, I guess, patients he's had. And that's kind of super interesting to hear, like, people who are extremely depressed or refuse to change, like, why they refuse to change. And it's easier to see it, like, when it's not looking at it internally, like you're pointing the finger at somebody that you know yourself, but some person that you have no connection to, and you're like, and then you eventually can relate that to either people in your life or yourself. And I'll honestly say, like, some of the main, not everything in this book I agree with, but most of it is really good. One of my main takeaways from this book is by far one of the chapters, I forget which chapter it is, but it talks about anger or like expectation being the reason for any emotion. Like, and I remember thinking, like, wow, that's so true. Like, if you think about any time you've ever been angry at anything or a reason why anyone's been angry ever, it's always because they expected something else to happen. It's not how they expected their life to go or that situation to go. And it makes me think, like, it a lot of times when you see somebody angry outside of, like, in actual life or anything, you can be like, it's not that life just isn't what they wanted. It's not the expectation they wanted. And that's, I don't know, that's kind of an interesting realization. And it might sound obvious, like, being stated like that, but I never really thought about it as being, like, why I get angry at things. Like, the reason I'm angry or the reason I'm disappointed, it's like, it's because it's always an expectation. You have an expectation of something in your head, like, before it happens. You have an idea of what you want to happen or what you think is going to happen. And if that doesn't happen, that's the reason you feel that way. And it kind of just tells you it kind of makes you just be self-aware in a weird way about, like, how the emotions that you have towards certain things. And I just thought it was a really good read. I think, like, if you've ever read any other or any book ever, it feels like, I don't know what the right word. Here's a good example. Like, any self-help book that you read, because I've read plenty in my day. They're honestly all garbage except for this one. It feels like they're all trying to do what this guy did, and, you know, the remakes are never as good as the original. For some reason, this book just is so much better than any other self-help book I've ever read. And I don't even want to call it a self-help book because I feel like it's selling it short. It's just like a deep dive into, like, the human mind and the psychology of it, of, like, and it's super interesting because for anyone who wants to improve themselves, I definitely think that you should at least read the first 72 pages, I think it is, which is just all about discipline. And after that, it jumps into, like, love and religion and things like that, which I didn't love the religion part, I'm not gonna lie, but the love part was really good, and the discipline part was just extremely out of this world. And I also really liked it talking about the risk like the risk in life and just any decision that you make. I always thought that was a good chapter. And it's super interesting because it talks about, it like relates science to God. It has a lot of conversations about like, science versus God, or does it have to be that way, which is kind of interesting. It's all the questions that I think most people want to ask or just aren't smart enough to answer themselves, just articulated in a way that makes sense. Yeah, and I just advise, because this is one of the only books that I've ever read cover to cover multiple times. Like, there's only maybe 2 other books that I've ever done that with, but this one, by far, by large, completely destroys like the amount of rereads I've ever done is this book. And the reason I even picked it up was actually because of the title. I remember in college I was like at one of those, outside of a library actually, like one of those pick up, leave a book, take a book library things, those free book give outs. And I did not drop off a book, so horrible of me, yes. But I remember seeing the title and thinking it reminded me of my favorite poem. And I don't even know, because this could just be a huge mix-up. I don't even know to this day if the poem's actually called The Road Less Traveled by, like, I think his name's like Frost or something. But something about, it's a poem about decision making, and I just thought that this book was going to be about that. In a weird way it is, but I think it's way more than that, just about decisions. It just and that's kind of the cool thing, I guess. Thinking into it now, it is just all about humans' decision, like why they make the decisions that they make, and what makes them make those decisions. And it's kind of interesting because it like brings in the nature versus nurture conversation, and it definitely leans heavily on the nurture aspect of things, and I don't disagree at all. I think it's a pretty good argument. But for anyone, I don't know. That's just because I have nothing else to talk about. But I just thought that I'd talk about my favorite book I've ever read. Would be kind of a good and interesting thing to talk about. But good review. Just honestly, check it out if you're interested. If you aren't, then don't do it. But I'm sure you can find free audiobook on YouTube for sure, and see if it's something you're into. But yeah.